Chapter 40. Dr. Flowers came to see Ruskin. "Tshoo!" was the first thing Dr. Flowers said, then continued. "Now, what are you doing in bed? It's been a week now. 7 days is too long to stay between the sheets." Ruskin touched Corky's walking stick. "I don't ever want to get up," Ruskin said. "I keep thinking of Corky and it upsets me too much to move." Tears trickled from Ruskin's eyes. Dr. Flowers gave him a handkerchief to dry his eyes. Then he stared at him from the end of his bed. "But you can't stay in bed forever," Dr. Flowers said. "Everyone in Lizard Street misses you." And his voice trailed away and he started to sniff. Ruskin thought he was trying to ward off another sneeze, but instead Dr. Flowers said, "I can smell potatoes." And sure enough, the next second, Mrs. Walnut came into Ruskin's bedroom, holding a packet of chocolate biscuits. "These are for you," she said, giving the biscuits to Ruskin. "I can't look at biscuits without wanting to cry," Ruskin said. "They remind me of the way Corky used to lick the chocolate off them." "But they're a present," Mrs. Walnut said. "You can't refuse a present. Corky wouldn't have wanted that." Then Mrs. Walnut started to sniff. "I can smell cigar smoke," she said. And sure enough, the next second, Mr. and Mrs. Cave came into Ruskin's bedroom with a bottle of cherryade. "This is for you," said Mrs. Cave, giving the bottle to Ruskin, but Ruskin was still crying and wished they would all go away and leave him alone. "My bedroom's getting too overcrowded," he said. "It's only meant for me, not everyone in Lizard Street." But still more people visited with presents. Mr. Lace came with some coloured pencils. Mr. Flick came with a photograph of the actor playing Henry V. They all stood at the end of Ruskin's bed and stared down at him. The room was so hot and stuffy with their breath that the windows started to mist up. "Get out of bed," said Mr. Lace. "We miss you in Lizard Street," said Mrs. Walnut. "I miss your squeaky whisper of a voice," said Mr. Lace. "I miss your knobbly knees," said Mr. Flick. "We miss your fuzzy red hair," said Mr. Cave. "Don't we, Mrs. Cave?" "Yes," said Mrs. Cave, "we do, Mr. Cave." And then all together they asked, "Why don't you get up?" "Because I miss Corky," cried Ruskin. They all looked at him in silence for a while. "Does anyone remember that story about Corky?" Mr. Lace said, looking around the room. "About what he did when he was a child. Something about a medal." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Walnut. "It was before our time. Years ago, I think. Corky was a boy. He was playing on a dump at the end of the street, where the pub is now." "That's right," Mr. Cave said. "It was before the pub was built. There was nothing there but rubbish and rubble. Corky was playing on the site when suddenly he found something." Ruskin had stopped crying now. He sat up in bed and looked at Mr. Cave. What did he find? "Something sticking out of the ground," Mr. Cave replied. "Pointed it was and silver and very, very smooth, made of metal." Ruskin leaned forward. "Like a giant silver fish head?" he asked. Mrs. Cave continued the story. "That's right," she said, puffing her cigar and flicking ash onto the end of the bed. "It was something from the war and very dangerous." "A bomb?" Ruskin said. "A bomb it was," said Dr. Flowers, "only Corky didn't know it was a bomb at the time, so he jumped in it and it started ticking." Ruskin gasped. "But that means, if Corky was to move, the bomb would have exploded." "Precisely," said Mr. Flick, continuing the story. "Luckily, someone heard it ticking and yelled to Corky to keep still." "So Corky kept still?" Ruskin said. "He kept very still," said Mr. Lace, sucking a pencil. "He kept the stillest he'd ever been," said Mrs. Walnut, her potato smell getting stronger. "He kept still for hours and hours," said Dr. Flowers, pinching his nose to ward off another sneeze. "He kept still until some experts came and defused the bomb," said Mr. Cave, puffing his cigar. "Didn't he, Mrs. Cave?" "He did, Mr. Cave," said Mrs. Cave, puffing her cigar. Ruskin was so engrossed with the story that he pushed the covers off him and stood up on his bed. "So that's why he got a medal," cried Ruskin, bouncing up and down on his mattress. Later, after everyone had gone, Ruskin lay in bed and thought about the story. Corky had saved Lizard Street. He had saved Lizard Street all by himself. He was a hero. And now it was Ruskin's turn. Now he had to protect Lizard Street too. Protect it from the thing that cracked the pavement, scorched the brickwork and dug holes in the road. Ruskin knew what he had to do. That night, while Lizard Street slept, he would tame Krindlekrax. Darkness. Darkness and silence. Night-time on Lizard Street. Ruskin got out of bed and put his ear to the wall. He could hear his mum and dad snoring and mumbling in their sleep. "It's not my fault," his dad was saying. "Polly Wolly Doodle all the day," his mum was saying. Ruskin got dressed, then put on the tin helmet and turned the torch on. The beam of light shot through the gloom and illuminated the photographs of actors on the wall opposite. Ruskin picked up the pin that had been on the medal and put it in his pocket. Then he picked up the walking stick, waving it in the air like a sword. "Now, unto the breach," Ruskin said, looking at himself in the mirror. His red frizzy hair stood out beneath the helmet, and his arms and legs weren't much thicker than the walking stick. Perhaps I don't look like a hero, Ruskin thought, but only I can save Lizard Street from the cracking and scorching and digging of Krindlekrax. Ruskin crept downstairs and went into the kitchen. The kitchen table was covered in piles of toast. As quietly as he could, Ruskin picked up some toast, opened the street door and went out into Lizard Street. The moon was full, illuminating the street with a ghostly blue light. The sky was clear and gleaming with stars. Ruskin went up to the metal drain and started to lay a trail of toast, leading away from the drain and down the street towards the school. He had to make several journeys back to his home because at the end of the line he wanted a pile of toast to act as a bait for Krindlekrax. Just as he was picking up the last remaining slice of toast, Ruskin heard something flapping. He grabbed the walking stick tightly. A bird, Ruskin thought. A bird is in the room. He looked round the kitchen, and wherever he looked the torch beam shone. It illuminated the toaster and the gas oven and the refrigerator and the dirty washing up in the sink, but it didn't illuminate a bird. Then Ruskin realised what the sound was. A gentle breeze was blowing outside, making the newspaper in the kitchen windows flap in and out, like something breathing or a bird's flapping wings. Ruskin heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "What a silly boy I am," he thought. He went back outside and completed building his pile of toast. The pile was so big, it was bigger than Ruskin. He went back to the drain and grasped hold of the metal cover. With all his might, he heaved it up and away from the drain hole. He stared down into the darkness. Down there in the watery dark was Krindlekrax, and soon Krindlekrax would smell the toast and rise from the depths to confront Ruskin. "Come on," said Ruskin, "I'm ready for you." The torch on Ruskin's helmet shone into the hole, illuminating the ladder leading down to the water below. Ruskin put his ear to the ground. No rumbling, nothing. Ruskin waited a little longer, then picked up a slice of toast and dropped it into the hole. He heard it splash. He waited. Nothing. He leaned over the hole. Still no rumbling. Nothing. Ruskin looked around him. He imagined all his neighbours curled up in their beds, sheets and blankets tucking them in, clocks ticking beside them, eyes rolling behind eyelids as they dreamed, unaware that he, Ruskin Splinter, was poised over a drain, waiting to do battle with Krindlekrax. And what would they be dreaming? Mr. and Mrs. Cave would be dreaming of their pub with its stained wood bar and satin cushions and carpet with red roses on. Mrs. Walnut would be dreaming of the day she could close the grocer's shop once and for all and stop smelling of potatoes. Mr. Flick would be dreaming of his black velvet lapels and all the films he had yet to show. Mr. Lace would be dreaming of pencils and Shakespeare. Dr. Flowers would be dreaming of the day he could stop sneezing. Elvis would be dreaming of smashing all the windows in the world. Sparky would be dreaming of saying yes sir to everything for the rest of his life. And in his house, his own mum and dad were busy dreaming too. Wendy of toast and tea and saying Polly Wolly Doodle all the day, and Winston of elephants and tigers and how happy he had felt in his zookeeper's uniform. Ruskin was in the midst of these thoughts when, eek! Ruskin jumped. He dropped the walking stick. It disappeared into the hole and landed with a splash in the water below. Eek! It was only the pub sign, but in Ruskin's nervous state it had scared him, and now Corky's walking stick was in the sewer. Ruskin stared into the hole. He'd already lost the medal. He couldn't lose the walking stick as well. Ruskin took a deep breath. There was no alternative. He would have to go into the sewer. He swung his legs over the edge and started climbing down the ladder. The last sound he heard before he disappeared beneath Lizard Street was the pub sign. Eek! 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 When Ruskin got to the bottom of the ladder, he stood on a brick ledge and stared at the sewer water running alongside like a dark green river. There were tin cans in the water, and bits of paper and carrots and bananas and all kinds of things Ruskin couldn't distinguish. His torchlight shone over walls covered with slime so thick it looked like grass. When he glanced up, Ruskin saw a circle of stars sparkling in the drain hole above. He looked around, searching for the walking stick. I've got to find it, he thought. He started to walk along the brick ledge, being careful not to slip. It was cold in the sewer and full of echoing sounds that made his eardrums ring. Suddenly, Ruskin saw the walking stick. It was floating in the water. The current was carrying it along deeper and deeper into the heart of the sewer. Ruskin ran until he was alongside the stick, then got to his knees and reached out. He stretched as far as he could. His fingers had just touched the walking stick when the current carried it off again. Ruskin jumped up and followed. He was breathing very hard now, and despite being cold, he was sweating. The torchlight flickered over walls and across the water. Corky was right, Ruskin thought. It is beautiful down here. The green of the slime sparkled like emeralds and the water was satin smooth. The walking stick stopped moving. It had got attached to some particularly thick slime. Ruskin rushed up, got to his knees and reached out. His fingertips grazed across the surface of the water. He grabbed hold of the walking stick. "Got it," he said. And that's when he realised it wasn't slime the stick was attached to. It was rats. Ruskin screamed. The water was alive with rats. Fat, dark rats with red eyes, long pink tails and vicious claws. The rats swam in the water, and as they swam, so they carried the walking stick with them. Ruskin followed, deeper and deeper into the sewer. He had never been this alone before. He'd always been in the bustle of Lizard Street, and even when Elvis and Sparky stopped being his friends and he thought he was alone, he wasn't really. He'd always had Mr. and Mrs. Cave and Mrs. Walnut and Mr. Flick and Mr. Lace and Dr. Flowers and his mum and dad and, of course, Corky. But now there was no one. Just darkness and water and hundreds of rats carrying the walking stick further and further into the labyrinth of darkness. Perhaps I'll never find my way out, Ruskin thought. Perhaps I'll have to stay here forever. Suddenly the rats climbed out of the water and one at a time disappeared into a rat hole in the brick ledge. The rats tried to take the walking stick with them, but the curve of the handle was too big to go through. When all the rats had gone into the hole, Ruskin rushed up and grabbed hold of the stick. He pulled. It was stuck. He pulled harder. Still stuck. I haven't come all this way to give up now, he thought. He pulled again, still stuck. Ruskin stood up straight, took a deep breath, spat on his hands and rubbed them together. He grabbed hold of the walking stick. "This one's for Corky," he cried, and pulled as hard as he could. Squelch went the walking stick, coming out of the hole. But the force of Ruskin's tug was so strong that, still holding the stick, he toppled and fell backwards into the water. Slimy green water went up his nose and into his ears. Ruskin coughed and spluttered. Fortunately, the water wasn't that deep and only came up to Ruskin's knees. He stood there for a while, clutching the walking stick, and then he thought of something. I must smell of toast, Ruskin thought. So why hasn't Krindlekrax come after me? Perhaps Krindlekrax doesn't exist. Perhaps it was just a story after all, just like his mum had said. Nothing but a story. He couldn't help feeling relieved at the thought of it. Ruskin started to laugh and splash about in the water. A story, he cried, and his voice echoed round him. A story, 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 story. And he called again, louder this time. Story, 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 story. But this time his echoes were interrupted by another sound. A roar like a million car brakes screeching all at once. Rah! Ruskin froze. He heard the sound of splashing getting closer. Waves appeared in the water. Rah! Went the roar again. Ruskin started to run. The roars got louder and louder. It was Krindlekrax.